unbelievable. She couldn't believe it. It was unbelievable. Oh yeah, she should have seen it coming. She should have known. After all, she has known this family for years and years. But still, when she heard the news, unbelievable. Who could have anticipated it? You would think, no matter what, that people would understand the consequences of their actions. She knew. She certainly did. Well, she didn't live in that tent, and who's she to say, but she knew. Neighbors always do. She had known this family from the very beginning. They all did. It was a small community. They all knew the story of how Isaac even came to be, about how God had made a promise to Isaac's father Abraham, and how God kept that promise even when Abraham and Sarah were way too old. Isaac came to be. And God had said through Abraham, God was going to put more descendants than stars in the sky, that Abraham was going to be the father of nations. And they knew it had to be true because, well, there was Isaac, and Isaac had no problem reminding them regularly about this. He was a sign of God's faithfulness and fulfillment. And then he laughed, which seemed appropriate somehow. Still, they'd been married for, she had to think, let me see, he was 40, 20 years. And it didn't look like God was still being faithful. It was just Isaac and Rebekah. And she remembered Rebekah's face when Rebekah would come and help her deliver her children. She'd take that new baby and she'd wash it and she'd hold it in her arms, and you could see the look on her face, the joy of that and the yearning, the wistfulness, and then as she'd hand the baby back, the sorrow. And her arms would be left empty. Over and over, Rebekah was there assisting in the births of babies, washing babies, holding them for a moment, and then giving them back. 20 years. It's been a long time. And for the last several years, Isaac had been noticing too. He'd watch his wife's face. He'd watch how she'd hold those babies and look at them. And he remembered God's relationship with them. And he turned to God, and for Rebekah, he prayed that she would be given a child. And God heard and answered her prayers, and all of a sudden she was expecting a baby, and the whole community celebrated. It was another sign of God's faithfulness to them, and they loved it, and she looked so happy. And then she got bigger. And then she got bigger. And she came by one day and said, I don't think I can stand it. It feels like my body's being taken over by aliens, and they're just constantly doing this in there. The neighbor could relate. And then Rebekah confessed that she had actually talked to God about this. She'd turned to God, which is what they knew to do, and had said, what is going on? And God had told her she had two nations within her, and that they were fighting with each other. Rebekah had a few words to say about that. And sure enough, when Rebekah's time came and she gave birth, the neighbor was there, and she saw that first child come into the world, and let me tell you, newborns are not pretty. And this one was hairy and red. But the really amazing thing is there were indeed two children within Rebekah's womb, and that second baby had a hold of that first baby's foot and was pulled out with the first. The neighbor never seen anything like it in her life. She cleaned them both up, held them, and then gave them back to Rebekah. And the look on her face as she held her baby in her arms for the first time, her children, that she wasn't going to have to give back to anybody else. They were hers. The neighbor watched, tears of joy. And then, well, neighbors do know best. She watched as those little boys grew, and it sure became obvious almost right away, before they even started really walking, that Isaac and Rebekah had favorites. Sometimes parents do. Sometimes there's a child they can relate to a little better than another. And in this case, boy, Isaac loved Esau. Esau was strong. He was tough. And even when he was little, he could take anything he wanted from his brother. He could wrestle the baby lambs down and pretend to eat them. He would stalk his little brother and hunt him down and sometimes tie him up and pretend to eat him too. You know, brotherly stuff. But Rebekah loved Jacob. Jacob liked to sit by her side and listen to her tell stories. And she would tell the stories of the family. She would tell about how God had been faithful to them, how God had made this great promise, and that Jacob's father, Isaac, was a sign of God's keeping that promise. And Jacob would listen. He liked to be with her. He liked to be at home. He learned to cook. He learned to tend the home fires, take care of the sheep, and was by her side. And it should have been nice. But, well, the neighbor might have said Esau was a little bit of a bully. She would have said Jacob was a little bit of a sneak. He had a way of looking so sweet and innocent right after he'd gotten his brother in trouble. I didn't do it. I swear. I was in the other room. Of course, I told Esau to do it, but I had nothing to do with it. I'm innocent. And they grew. And their conflicts became a little more spiteful. But here's where it got interesting. The neighbor would think, no one in this family is remembering who they are and what God is already doing in their lives because I'm watching. I might not live in that tent, but I'm watching, and I know what's best. Because that's what neighbors do. And I can tell you, Isaac, he is just watching Esau, and he cannot wait to go strutting around with his chest out going, did you see what my son caught last time? Do you know he can walk farther and carry a heavier carcass than any other man around? Which was probably true if you've seen the size of Esau. And Rebekah, she could not stop to talk about how smart her son was, how clever, how really things should be left under Jacob's care because Esau didn't care about that kind of stuff. And all of Isaac's belongings, his land, all that should be put in the care of someone who understood it. And oh, Jacob did. The neighbor wondered, did she forget what God told her, that two nations were within her, that each of them was going to have their own way of being? Oh no, she had her eye out for one thing. And then the boys, as if their parents weren't focused enough on what they could achieve through their children, the children became focused on what they could achieve for themselves. Esau learned. He was big. He was strong. He was skilled at what he did. He was a great hunter. If he wanted something, he could go get it and take it, and it was his. And if his brother had something, that just meant that he had to take it from his brother, and that was no problem, because really it was all his anyway. And his father would look at him and say, good for you. You go for it. And he did. If he was hungry, he would eat. If he was tired, he would sleep. If he wanted to have something you had, he could take it because it was really all his anyway, right? He was going to inherit it. Jacob's hungers were different. It wasn't all about food. It wasn't all about conquest. Not in the same way. It was about power. It was about control. Jacob was hungry to be respected. He was hungry to be the one who could make the decisions and to be looked up to and to be valued for what he could do and what power he had over you. They were hungry boys, and they saw each other as nothing but an obstacle in their way. But still, when that day happened, and she heard, she couldn't believe it. You'd think they would have known better. She could have told them. Oh yeah, in fact, she's pretty sure she did a time or two. But who listens to neighbors? So Esau had come back. That's what she'd heard. He'd come back from hunting, and he was hungry, and he walked into the tent just like he owned a place, which he thought he did. And he saw the stew that Jacob had made, and he said, I'm hungry. Give me some of that. And Jacob said, you all heard, no, I don't think so. I am hungry. I am going to die if I don't get something to eat. So give me some. No, please. And Jacob said, sure, absolutely. I will give you some stew. I'll give you some bread. I'll give you something to drink. If. Now you would have thought at this point, Esau and Jacob have been living together a long time. You'd have thought Esau would have known, as soon as that if got spoken, that something was coming. But he was thinking with his belly, and he didn't pay any attention. If what? I'm hungry. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll give you all that if you give me your birthright. What? Is that all? Sure. No problem. Give me this stew. And he munches it up, and he just walks off. Now, can you believe that? Did he not understand? Oh, sure. You can make the argument that Esau thought nothing would change his relationship with his father. He was a favorite after all, and he could do all those manly things. Surely a birthright, a spoken word wouldn't change any of that. But still, he should have known. Birthrights are everything to us, and he just treated it like it was nothing. And Jacob, what was he thinking? Did he think nobody would notice and that they would all celebrate that he somehow tricked his big brother out of this? That we would respect someone who got a birthright by trickery? What was he thinking? It was appalling. And yet there he was, seemingly proud of this, and Rebekah seemed thrilled. How can that be? They're supposed to be the people through whom God is acting. They're supposed to have had conversations. They turned to God when they were in times of need, and God responded, and they knew God would, which is why they spoke to God. Why did they think that God would be in charge of their children's lives? Why did the children, having heard these stories, not trusted that God was already doing something for them? Why did Jacob and Esau, having heard time and time again about God's faithfulness and God's grace and God's power and God's ability, not trusted in that instead of trying to grab what they were hungry for themselves? Why would that be? What would it take for God to have shown this family what God expected so that they would start honoring what they'd already been given by God, God's special relationship, instead of lusting after these hungers? You'd almost say, wouldn't you, that God would have to take on flesh and live with them and eat at the table with them and talk to them face to face and show them what it meant to live as a child of God. You'd almost think God would have to do that. And then, I tell you, if God did that, well, there is no way anyone could refuse to live into that. There's no way. Right? And all the people say,